I knew something was wrong before I even made it halfway across my kitchen. Not because I saw anything, because I didn't hear anything. Every morning for almost 15 years, my two dogs would lose their minds the second a squirrel crossed the back fence. It was like clockwork, barking, growling, carrying on like they were defending Fort Knox. But that morning, nothing, just silence. The kind of silence that makes you stop walking without even realizing it. I grabbed my coffee mug and looked through the back window toward the property line. Both dogs were standing near the garden, completely still, staring toward the old punk shed behind my house. That's when I saw it. At first I thought somebody had dumped a toolbox on my property. Then the sunrise hit it. Bright silver steel, fresh metal, industrial hinges. And right there over my well pump sat a brand new lockbox bolted directly onto equipment that belonged to me. I just stood there blinking. Maybe 5 seconds, maybe 30. My brain honestly refused to catch up, because this wasn't some shared utility. This wasn't community property. This wasn't even near the subdivision. This was my private well, my land, my electricity, my water. I had drilled that well years before half the people in our neighborhood even moved in. And somehow somebody had decided they had the authority to put a lock on it. The closer I got, the worse it looked. Fresh drill marks glittered around the mounting brackets. The steel housing covered every access point. A heavy padlock hung from the front. And zip-tied to the handle was a bright red notice. Property compliance violation. Unauthorized water access. I actually laughed. Not because it was funny. Because sometimes something is so ridiculous your brain doesn't know what else to do. I ripped the notice off and read it twice. Then a third time. Same result. Still insane. The signature at the bottom belonged to the newly elected president of Cedar Ridge Estates HOA. His name was Malcolm Voss. And if you've ever met somebody who smiles while threatening you, you'd understand Malcolm immediately. 6 months earlier, Cedar Ridge had elected a completely new HOA board after a wave of retirees moved into the neighborhood from California, Arizona, and Colorado. At first, nobody paid much attention. They talked about improving property values, neighborhood beautification, community standards, the usual stuff. Then things started getting weird. First it was mailbox colors, then fence heights, then approved flower species. I'm not kidding. One woman got a warning because her hydrangeas were apparently the wrong shade of blue. The board held 3 separate meetings discussing lawn symmetry. Lawn symmetry. Imagine having that much free time. Most of us laughed it off, but Malcolm wasn't joking. Little by little the board kept expanding its reach. Every month, there was some new initiative, some new rule, some new fee, and eventually they found something much bigger to chase. Utilities, specifically water. The board announced plans to build a centralized neighborhood water service that every homeowner would supposedly benefit from. According to Malcolm, it would increase reliability, improve property values, strengthen community infrastructure, and about 50 other phrases that sounded impressive if you didn't think about them too hard. The problem was that several homes on the outer lots already had private wells, legal wells, permitted wells, working wells, mine included. We didn't need their system. We didn't want their monthly fees. And we definitely didn't want somebody else controlling our water. At first I tried being polite. That was probably my biggest mistake. 3 weeks before the lockbox appeared, Malcolm mailed me a formal notice requesting that I voluntarily disconnect my private well and transition into the community water network. I tossed it in a drawer. A week later, another letter arrived. This one sounded less like a request and more like a warning. Then came the phone calls, then the emails, then the visits. One evening, Malcolm actually showed up at my front porch carrying a clipboard. I still remember the conversation. He smiled and said, "Dylan, we're trying to bring everyone together under one system." I said, "Sounds expensive." His smile got tighter. "It's about community cooperation." I leaned against the doorway and shrugged. "My well works fine." For a second, something flashed across his face. Not anger. Something worse. Offense. Like I had personally insulted him. Then he nodded slowly and said, "People who resist progress usually end up regretting it." I remember watching his truck disappear down the road afterward and thinking what a strange thing that was to say over water. Now, standing beside that steel lockbox, staring at the violation notice in my hand, I finally understood what he meant. This was never about water. It was about obedience. And deep down, Before I even picked up my phone, before I called the HOA office, before everything that happened next turned our quiet neighborhood upside down, I had a feeling Malcolm Voss had just made the biggest mistake of his life. The second I got back inside, I called the HOA office. I wasn't even angry yet, mostly confused, because surely there had to be some explanation, some misunderstanding, some wildly incompetent contractor who had locked the wrong equipment. At least that's what I told myself while the phone rang. After 3 transfers and enough elevator music to drive a man insane, Malcolm finally picked up. "Good morning, Dylan." That right there annoyed me. The fact that he sounded so calm, like he'd been expecting my call. I said, "Tell me why there's a steel box locked over my well." A pause, then a soft chuckle. Not nervous, not embarrassed, amused. "Dylan," he said, "we were wondering when you'd notice." I remember gripping the phone so hard my knuckles turned white. "You've got 1 hour to remove it." Another chuckle. "If you intend to remain part of this community, cooperation is no longer optional." There it was, the real message. Not hidden, not dressed up, just sitting there in plain English. Cooperate, or else. I hung up before I said something stupid. That afternoon I called a county office, then another one, then a state permitting department. Every conversation ended the same way. Nobody could find any regulation giving an HOA authority over a privately permitted groundwater well. Nobody. That should have reassured me. Instead, it made me nervous. Because if Malcolm wasn't operating under actual authority, then he was operating under something else. Confidence. And confidence can be dangerous when enough people mistake it for power. The next morning, things got worse. I walked into the kitchen, turned on the faucet, and heard absolutely nothing. No pressure. No spattering. No drip. Nothing. The silence coming out of those pipes felt louder than any sound I'd ever heard. I checked the breaker panel. One circuit had been switched off. The one feeding power to the well pump. I stood there staring at it for a long moment. Then I started laughing. Not because it was funny, because it had finally crossed a line so absurd that anger couldn't keep up anymore. Somebody had physically tampered with my utilities, on my property, to force me into their system. And suddenly a thought appeared in my head that refused to leave. What if Malcolm was hiding something? Not just being controlling, not just overstepping, actually hiding something. Because people who are winning legally don't usually risk doing illegal things. That thought followed me for the rest of the day. It followed me through dinner, through the evening news, through a sleepless night staring at my bedroom ceiling. And by sunrise the next morning, I made up my mind. I was going digging. Now, if you've never spent a day inside a county records office, let me save you the experience. Imagine a building where time gave up sometime around 1994. Faded carpets. Metal filing cabinets, dust everywhere, the smell of old paper and burnt coffee floating through the hallways. I drove 45 minutes into the county seat and spent nearly 7 hours buried in maps, permits, utility filings, environmental reports, and zoning records. At first I found nothing. Then I found something strange, a permit application that didn't match the dates on the HOA announcements. Then another document with missing approval signatures. Then a utility map that looked wrong. Very wrong. I remember spreading the paperwork across a wooden table and staring at it. The more pieces I found, the less sense the official story made. According to HOA newsletters, the community water system was a brand new infrastructure project. According to county records, it wasn't. Not even close. The pipe network feeding Cedar Ridge wasn't originally designed for residential use at all. It had started life nearly 12 years earlier as part of an agricultural irrigation system serving a former pecan farm outside county limits. The more I dug, the uglier it got. There were modification permits that had never been approved, inspection records that simply didn't exist, water treatment certifications missing entirely, required testing reports nowhere to be found. I kept flipping pages. My stomach kept sinking. By the time I finished, I realized something that made the hair stand up on the back of my neck. The HOA wasn't operating a legitimate residential water utility. They were operating a patched-together irrigation network and charging homeowners monthly service fees for it. I leaned back in my chair. The old ceiling fan above me clicked slowly. Back and forth. Back and forth. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I wasn't angry. I was excited, because suddenly the lockbox made sense. The threats made sense. The pressure made sense. Malcolm wasn't forcing people into the system because it was better. He was forcing people into the system because he needed everyone connected. Every homeowner who remained independent was a reminder that participation wasn't actually mandatory. And if enough people asked questions, the whole thing could collapse. I spent another 2 hours copying records, photographing maps, highlighting permit numbers, building a paper trail. Then I drove home without saying a word to anyone. That night, I spread everything across my dining room table. Pages covered every inch of wood. The evidence looked like something out of a detective movie. Around 8 o'clock, I called the State Water Resources Compliance Division. The woman who answered sounded exhausted, like she'd spent 20 years listening to complaints about drainage ditches and broken culverts. At first, her voice barely changed while I explained the situation. Then I mentioned the lockbox. Silence. Then typing. Lots of typing. Wait, she interrupted. They physically restricted access to your permitted groundwater source? Yes. More typing. And the residential system they're requiring homeowners to join, is it registered through state distribution licensing? No, ma'am. Another pause. Longer this time. I could practically hear her reading something on a screen. Then she finally exhaled, slowly, and said words that felt like music. Sir, if the documentation you have is accurate, this appears to be a significant compliance violation. Significant compliance violation. That might sound boring to most people. To me, it sounded beautiful. She asked me to email every document I had collected. I sent everything within the hour. Maps, permits, photos, notices, the lockbox, the breaker, every single piece. Before hanging up, she told me investigators would likely review the complaint and determine next steps. Could be weeks. Could be longer. Government timelines aren't exactly famous for speed. Still, I slept better that night than I had in days. Meanwhile, Malcolm kept escalating. Violation notices appeared on my door every few days. Unautorised utility usage. Community non-compliance penalties. Potential lien review. Administrative fines. The language got more aggressive with each letter. Almost desperate. Then one afternoon, I spotted Malcolm driving slowly past my house in a golf cart with 2 board members riding beside him. Like some kind of suburban parade. He waved. Actually waved. That smug little smile sitting on his face. The kind of smile people wear when they think they've already won. I waved back. And for the first time since this started, I smiled too. Because Malcolm thought I was isolated. He thought I was cornered. He thought I was running out of options. What he didn't know was that somewhere inside a state office, people with badges, clipboards, and legal authority were already reading his paperwork. And if my instincts were right, they were about to discover something far worse than an independent homeowner refusing to cooperate. They were about to discover an entire neighborhood built on a lie. And 2 weeks later, just after 8 o'clock on a Tuesday morning, I looked out my front window and saw 3 white government trucks rolling into Cedar Ridge Estates. That's when I knew the real show was finally about to begin. At first, I thought it might be a utility crew. Then I saw the logos on the doors. State inspectors, county compliance officers, environmental regulators. And parked behind them was a sheriff's vehicle. I nearly dropped my coffee. For a second, I just stood there staring through the window. Then I stepped out onto my porch and watched the convoy roll deeper into Cedar Ridge. The neighborhood woke up fast. Front doors opened. Garage doors lifted. People wandered outside pretending they weren't interested while very obviously being interested. Within 15 minutes, small groups had formed along sidewalks and driveways. Everyone was watching, especially Malcolm. I spotted him almost immediately. He came storming out of the clubhouse, carrying a thick binder under one arm. Even from a distance, I could tell he was rattled. The confident smile was gone. The relaxed posture was gone. For the first time since I'd known him, Malcolm looked nervous. He walked directly toward the lead inspector and immediately started talking. A lot. Hands moving. Binder opening. Pages flipping. The inspector barely reacted. Just kept writing notes. As more vehicles arrived, teams spread throughout the neighborhood. Some collected water samples. Others photographed equipment. A few followed underground utility maps. Nobody seemed interested in Malcolm's explanations. And that was when things started unraveling. Fast. Around mid-morning, a group of inspectors moved behind the clubhouse toward a landscape flower bed most residents never paid attention to. A few workers removed decorative stones. Then some mulch. Then a wooden cover. A crowd gathered almost immediately. People started whispering, pointing, taking photos. And when the inspectors exposed what was underneath, the mood changed completely. Even from where I stood, I could tell it wasn't good. Valves, improvised connections, pressure regulators, residential branch lines tied into infrastructure that clearly wasn't designed for neighborhood distribution. The inspectors documented everything. Every pipe, every fitting, every modification. The sheriff spent several minutes speaking with one of the investigators before stepping aside to make a radio call. That's when Malcolm's face went completely pale. Not embarrassed, not frustrated, terrified. The kind of look people get when they suddenly realize a situation has moved beyond their ability to control it. By lunchtime, emergency notices started appearing throughout Cedar Ridge. Officials went door to door posting warnings. Residents were instructed not to drink the community water, not to cook with it, not to use it until testing could be completed. The reaction was immediate and ugly, because here's something I've learned about people. They'll tolerate a lot when a problem feels theoretical. The second it affects them personally, everything changes. Neighbors who had defended the board for months suddenly wanted answers. Families started demanding explanations. People gathered outside the clubhouse. Voices got louder, then louder still. One homeowner shouted, "You told us this was approved." Another yelled, "We've been paying for this for years." Nobody had much interest in Malcolm's speeches anymore. The spell had broken, and once authority loses credibility in public, it rarely gets a second chance. Then came my favorite moment. One of the inspectors walked across my property carrying a pair of bolt cutters. He nodded toward the steel lockbox covering my well equipment. "Mr. Carter? That's me. This the structure they installed?" I smiled. "Sure is." He examined it for maybe 10 seconds, photographed it, made a few notes, then positioned the cutters around the HOA padlock. The sound that followed was beautiful. One sharp metallic crack. That's all it took. The lock fell into the dirt. Just like that. Weeks of threats. Weeks of intimidation. Weeks of letters and fines and pressure. Gone in a single second. Another inspector removed the housing while documenting every piece. Photos, measurements, evidence tags. The whole thing looked more like a crime scene than a utility inspection. Once they finished, I walked over to my electrical panel, flipped the breaker back on, and waited. A few seconds later, I heard the familiar rumble. Deep, mechanical, reliable. The sound of my well pump coming back to life. I hadn't realized how much I'd missed that sound until I heard it again. I connected a garden hose and opened the valve. Water burst out in a powerful stream, sparkling under the afternoon sunlight. For a moment, everything seemed quiet. Then I noticed people watching, all over the neighborhood, dozens of them, looking directly at me. Not because I was special, because they finally understood. The independent homeowner they'd spent months treating like a troublemaker hadn't been the problem. The problem had been standing in the clubhouse the entire time. Over the next several weeks, the fallout was brutal. Regulatory penalties hit the HOA hard. Insurance providers started asking uncomfortable questions. Residents demanded financial records. Then investigators uncovered something even worse. Money. Of course it was money. A significant portion of the utility fees collected from homeowners had been routed into what the board described as administrative compensation. Fancy words, simple meaning. Certain board members have been paying themselves. The moment that information became public, whatever support remained disappeared overnight. Resignations followed. Lawyers appeared. Meetings were canceled. People stopped returning calls. And Malcolm? Malcolm vanished. 1 week in his office was cleaned out. His truck disappeared. His house went up for sale. Nobody got a goodbye speech. Nobody got an apology. Just silence. Funny how people who love authority suddenly become hard to find when accountability arrives. Eventually, the HOA reached settlements with several homeowners, including me. They paid for repairs, removed every violation, reimbursed damages, and worked very hard to keep certain records out of public court proceedings, which tells you everything you need to know. These days, life is pretty quiet again. Most mornings, I still make coffee before sunrise. I still step onto my back porch. The dogs are older now, slower too. The neighborhood feels different, calmer, maybe wiser. And every once in a while, I'll turn on the kitchen faucet and listen to the water running for a few extra seconds. Not because I need to, because it reminds me of something. The strangest part of this whole story wasn't the illegal pipeline. It wasn't the lockbox. It wasn't even the investigation. It was how many intelligent people accepted something they knew felt wrong simply because someone spoke with confidence while giving orders. That's the part that sticks with me. Authority isn't the same thing as ownership. Confidence isn't the same thing as legality. And paperwork matters a whole lot more than personality when the truth finally shows up. Maybe that's the real lesson here. Most people don't lose rights all at once. They give away tiny pieces at a time because resisting feels uncomfortable, because keeping the peace feels easier, because nobody wants to be the difficult neighbor, until one day they wake up and realize someone else has started making decisions they never had the right to make in the first place. So now I'm curious. What do you think? Was Malcolm a deliberate con artist from the beginning? Or do you think he started with good intentions and slowly got addicted to power? And have you ever dealt with an HOA, landlord, board member, or local official who pushed way beyond what they were legally allowed to do? Let me know down in the comments, because after everything that happened in Cedar Ridge, I honestly believe stories like this are a lot more common than most people realize. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share it with someone who loves real-life neighborhood drama. And remember, the next time somebody starts throwing rules around, ask to see the paperwork first.